The revolver's barrel felt cold against Miles Harper's temple, its familiar weight both comforting and terrifying in the dying light of day. Around him, 3 fresh graves lay open to the desert sky like wounds in the earth, Sarah Thomas Mary. His entire world reduced to wooden markers and the endless ache in his chest. Just one squeeze. He whispered to the wind that carved through Lone Creek's cemetery, bending the weathered crosses into supplicant shapes. One squeeze and the pain stops. His finger tightened on the trigger. Sarah's laughter echoed in his memory the way she'd giggled when he'd proposed flour in her hair from baking bread. Thomas's excited voice calling "Papa" as he ran toward the barn. Mary's tiny hand curled around his finger, trusting and warm. All silenced by fever in 7 brutal days. The gun trembled. Miles closed his eyes, feeling the desert's vast emptiness mirror the hollow space where his heart used to be. Then, soft as a prayer, came the sound of footsteps on gravel. Miles. Preacher Abner's voice carried no judgment, only infinite weariness. "Gun won't bring them back, son." "Then what's the point of breathing?" Miles's voice cracked like dried leather. Abner knelt beside him, his weathered hands steady despite his 70 years. "Because sometimes the living need more saving than the dead." As if summoned by his words, a child's cry pierced the evening air. From somewhere in town, thin, desperate, the sound of someone utterly alone. Miles's finger relaxed on the trigger despite himself. Somewhere in Lone Creek, another soul was drowning in their own darkness. "A God's got work left for you, Miles Harper," Abner said softly. "Question is whether you're man enough to do it." The revolver fell from Miles's nerveless fingers, landing with a dull thud among the desert stones. He doubled over shoulders, shaking with silent sobs that tore through him like barbed wire. In the distance, that child's crying continued, a sound that would haunt him for weeks to come, not knowing it was the voice of his future calling out across the darkness. 6 weeks crawled by like dying animals across the desert floor. The Harper Ranch squatted 3 miles outside Lone Creek, a modest collection of weathered buildings that seemed to shrink under the endless sky. The house felt cavernous, now filled with echoes and the ghosts of laughter that would never return. But it wasn't empty. They'd arrived one by one, drawn by desperation and the frontier's invisible network of the forgotten. Ben Cartwright came first, 14 years old, with his father's stubborn jaw and eyes that had seen too much. His parents had been butchered by raiders last spring while he'd hidden in a grain cellar listening to their screams. "Don't need charity," he'd said, standing on Miles's porch with his clothes torn and his pride intact. "Just work for food." Miles had wordlessly set a place at the table. Sometimes salvation wore the face of a half-starved boy too proud to beg. The Morrison twins followed Jake and Luke, 11 years old and identical, except for the scar across Jake's forehead, where their drunken father had thrown a bottle before disappearing into the desert forever. They spoke in whispers and moved like shadows, as if making themselves small might prevent the world from noticing them again. Little Marcy arrived clinging to the back of a supply wagon, her parents' blood still dark under her fingernails. The Apache had taken her family's wagon train, but somehow she'd escaped into the desert with nothing but a corn-husk doll and eyes that held too much knowledge for someone barely 6 years old. Anna Kowalski spoke with her dead parents' Polish accent and possessed a practical streak that kept the household running. Her parents had succumbed to consumption in the town's only boarding house, leaving her with 3 English words and an unshakable determination to survive. Samuel was the youngest at 4, found crying on the church steps with a note pinned to his shirt. "His name is Samuel. I cannot care for him anymore. Please be kind." No mother's name, no explanation. Just another child thrown into the world's indifferent hands. Miles hadn't planned to collect them. It started with Ben, continued with necessity, and became something approaching purpose. The children sensed his own brokenness and responded to it, damaged recognizing damaged, finding comfort in shared understanding of loss. Mrs. Finch, his gruff neighbor, left bread and preserves at his gate twice weekly. "Fool's errand, feeding every stray in the territory," she'd mutter, but the food kept coming. Preacher Abner visited every Sunday, offering prayers and worried glances at the growing collection of hollow-eyed children. The town watched with mixed feelings. Some whispered that Miles Harper had lost his sanity along with his family. Others complained about the burden on decent folk harboring vagrants and strays. But nobody intervened directly. The children were off the streets after all. And Miles kept to himself. But Miles felt himself drowning daily. He'd been a capable rancher, once managing cattle and crops with quiet competence. Now he struggled to provide basic necessities for 7 people. His cooking was disastrous. Burned beans and scorched cornbread were regular fare. The children learned to forage and barter work at neighboring ranches for eggs and milk. Ben grew more sullen each day, his anger a powder keg waiting for ignition. The twins had nightmares that left them screaming. Anna appointed herself caretaker of little Samuel, who wet his bed and cried for a mother who'd abandoned him. Marcy rarely spoke, clutching her doll and watching the desert as if expecting more raiders to emerge from the scrub brush. Miles recognized the signs. They were all barely holding on, bound together by shared desperation, and the understanding that this ramshackle arrangement was their only alternative to complete dissolution. But desperation wasn't enough to build a future on, and winter was coming. Something had to change. Miles just didn't realize the change would arrive in the form of a broken woman sitting outside Hannigan's general store, holding a tin cup and waiting for whatever kindness the world might spare. The morning Miles rode into Lone Creek for supplies, the October air carried the bite of approaching winter. His pockets held exactly $8.43, enough for basic necessities. If he shopped carefully, not enough for anything approaching comfort. The children needed warm clothes, better food, medicine for Marcy's persistent cough. They needed more than he could provide. Lone Creek bustled with its usual mix of ranchers, merchants, and drifters. Dust devils swirled between the buildings, carrying the scent of horses' leather and human determination. Miles tied his wagon outside Hannigan's general store and prepared for another exercise in stretching pennies. That's when he saw her. She sat in the narrow shade beside the store's entrance, back pressed against the weathered wall, knees drawn to her chest. Her dress had once been green calico, but was now a patchwork of repairs and desperation. Dark hair hung in matted curtains around a face that might have been beautiful before hunger carved it hollow. A tin cup sat beside her, containing 3 copper pennies and a button. She didn't actively beg, just existed in that small slice of shade, waiting for whatever mercy might come her way. Miles recognized something in her stillness, the careful way she held herself apart from the world. He'd felt that same disconnection, that sense of being present but not quite alive. I've been there 3 days now. Mrs. Finch's voice made him jump. She stood behind him, arms full of packages, studying the woman with shrewd eyes. Won't hardly speak to nobody. Showed up on the morning stage from Tucson, barely had fare to pay. What's her story? Nobody knows. Driver said she got on looking half dead, paid her fare with the last coins in her purse. Been living on church charity and whatever folks can spare. Mrs. Finch's expression softened slightly. Preacher's trying to find her people, but she ain't saying much beyond her name, Isabel Kane. Miles watched Isabel Kane's careful breathing, the way her eyes tracked movement, without appearing to look directly at anyone. She was afraid, not just hungry or desperate, but genuinely terrified. Something had driven her to this desert town, and it hadn't been wanderlust. Those children of yours could use a woman's touch, Mrs. Finch observed carefully. And Lord knows she could use honest work. The suggestion hit Miles like cold water. Another woman in Sarah's kitchen felt like betrayal. But then he thought of Marcy's cough, Anna's torn dress that he didn't know how to mend. And to the way Ben looked at him sometimes, as if waiting for complete failure, he approached, slowly removing his hat. "Ma'am, I'm Miles Harper. I run a ranch outside town and I find myself in need of help with some children. Cooking mostly general household work. It's honest employment with room and board. She looked up at him with dark eyes that held depths of pain he couldn't fathom. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible, roughened by disuse and fear. How many children? 6. All orphans, more or less. They've had a hard time of it, but they're good kids. Something flickered in her expression, recognition perhaps, or understanding born of shared experience. She glanced at her tin cup, at the meager coins that represented her entire worldly wealth. I don't have anywhere else to go, she said finally. Neither do they, Miles replied. Maybe we can help each other figure out where we're headed. The ride to the ranch passed in silence, except for wagon wheels and wind. Isabel sat rigidly beside him, clutching a small cloth bundle and a water-stained carpet bag that held everything she owned. She flinched at every unexpected sound, hawk cries, cattle lowing the rattle of loose harness. When the Harper homestead came into view, 6 faces appeared at windows and doorways. The children had been waiting, curious and defensive in equal measure. They emerged onto the front porch like young sentinels studying this newcomer, who might or might not become part of their fragile world. Children, Miles said as he helped Isabel down. This is Miss Kane. She'll be helping us out for a spell. We don't need help, Ben said flatly, his young face hard with premature cynicism. We've been managing fine. The house showed signs of that management crooked laundry, dirty dishes, the lingering smell of burned food. They'd been surviving barely, but survival wasn't the same as living. Miss Kane will be cooking for us. Miles continued ignoring Ben's challenge. And helping with other tasks. I expect you to treat her with courtesy. Isabel stood frozen under their collective scrutiny. These children reflected her own experience, abandonment, loss, the bone-deep fear that comes from having stability ripped away repeatedly. She wanted to run, to climb back on that wagon and disappear into the desert's anonymity. Instead, she forced herself to speak. I hope we can help each other, she said, her voice barely carrying across the porch. It was a hope that would be tested severely in the days to come. The first week was an unmitigated disaster. Isabel's hands shook so violently, she could barely hold a kitchen knife. She burned 3 consecutive meals, turning good beef into charcoal and reducing perfectly acceptable beans to smoking ruins. The children watched with poorly concealed amusement as she struggled with tasks that should have been simple. Sleep proved impossible. Every settling timber, every gust of wind against the windows sent her bolt upright heart hammering against her ribs. She'd taken the small room off the kitchen that had once been Sarah's sewing space, and the walls felt like they were closing in. More than once, Miles found her sitting on the front porch at dawn, staring toward the horizon as if planning escape routes. The children tested her mercilessly. Jake and Luke hid dead mice in her flower bin. Anna, accidentally, knocked over buckets of water she'd just drawn from the well. Ben openly defied any suggestion she made, doing precisely the opposite out of stubborn principle. Only little Samuel remained neutral, watching her with the solemn curiosity of someone too young to understand the full complexity of adult failure. Maybe this wasn't such a wise idea. Preacher Abner observed during his Sunday visit, finding chaos in the kitchen and tears on Isabel's face. The woman's clearly struggling, and the children are acting out worse than usual. Give it time, Miles said, but his voice lacked conviction. The town was already talking questions about propriety, about strange women living in widowed men's houses, about what kind of example this set for impressionable children. That evening, everything changed. Little Marcy woke screaming, her small body burning with fever. Miles paced helplessly as the child writhed in delirium, calling for parents who would never answer. He'd lost his own children to fever, and seeing Marcy in illness's grip sent him into barely controlled panic. Isabel appeared in the doorway, wearing her nightgown, hair loose around her shoulders. Without a word, she pushed past Miles and knelt beside the bed, pressing her palm to Marcy's forehead. "Get me cool water," she said, her voice suddenly steady and sure. "And willow bark, if you have it, anything with bitter-tasting bark." For 12 hours, Isabel never left Marcy's side. She bathed the child's fevered skin with damp cloths, coaxed bitter tea between her lips, and sang soft lullabies in a language Miles didn't recognize. Her hands, so clumsy with kitchen tasks, moved with gentle certainty as she tended the sick child. By dawn, the fever had broken. Marcy slept peacefully, breathing easy and natural. The other children, who had taken turns watching from the doorway, looked at Isabel with transformed eyes. She had saved one of their own, creating a bond stronger than blood. "Where did you learn healing?" Miles asked as they sat on the porch, exhausted but relieved. Isabel was quiet for a long moment, watching sunrise paint the desert in gold and crimson. "My grandmother taught me about plants, about tending the sick. She said a woman needed to know how to care for her family. It was the first personal information she'd shared, and Miles sensed vast depths beneath the surface. But he didn't push. Some stories had to emerge in their own time. From that morning forward, the household dynamic shifted. The children still tested boundaries, but respect had entered the equation. Isabel's cooking improved as her confidence grew. She began teaching them practical skills: how to set snares for rabbits, identify edible desert plants, preserve food, and mend clothing. Survival knowledge learned through hard experience during years she still wouldn't discuss. "You've been on your own for a long time," Miles observed one evening as they worked side by side preparing dinner. "Long enough to forget what it feels like to belong somewhere." She replied softly, "Maybe it's time to remember." She looked at him, then hope warring with fear in her dark eyes. "I'm not sure I know how anymore." "None of us do," Miles said, glancing toward the children. "But maybe we can figure it out together." It was a fragile beginning built on shared damage and tentative trust. But for the first time since Sarah's death, Miles Harper began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could build something worth saving from the wreckage of their separate losses. The house began to feel like home again, careful, uncertain, but real. And though none of them knew it yet, they were about to face trials that would test every bond they'd begun to form. As autumn deepened into winter's approach, an uneasy peace settled over the Harper ranch. Isabel had found her rhythm, and the children had grudgingly accepted her presence. But peace in the territory was always temporary, and whispers of trouble drifted in with the cold winds from the north. The first warning came from Tom Brewster, whose ranch bordered theirs to the east. He rode up one crisp November morning, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by grim concern. "Miles, you need to keep your eyes open," he said, accepting coffee from Isabel with distracted courtesy. "Lost 30 head last week. Professional job, whoever did it knew cattle and knew the land." Sheriff Ethan Grice had taken the position 6 months earlier, when old Bill Hawkins simply vanished one night. Grice was younger, harder, with pale eyes that missed nothing and revealed less. He'd brought order to Lone Creek, people said, but at a cost few were willing to discuss openly. "What makes you think it's more than ordinary rustlers?" Miles asked. "The precision. They took the best breeding stock, left the rest untouched. Knew exactly where to find water which passes to use. This wasn't random theft, it was calculated harvest." After Brewster left, Miles found himself scanning the horizon more frequently. He'd moved his small herd closer to the house and started carrying his rifle during fence checks. The children sensed the growing tension, becoming quieter and more watchful. Isabel was changing too, but in ways that both encouraged and worried Miles. She'd gained weight, her face losing that hollow, haunted appearance. She laughed sometimes now, usually at Samuel's innocent observations or Anna's dry wit. The children trusted her increasingly, even Ben, though he maintained careful emotional distance. But there were moments when Miles caught her staring toward the desert with an expression he couldn't read. Fear, maybe, or recognition. Once he'd seen her teaching the children how to move silently through brush, how to hide tracks, how to find water in seemingly dry creek beds. Useful skills, but not ones most women possessed. The second incident struck closer to home. Mrs. Pemberton's general store was robbed just after closing 3 masked men, taking not just money, but specific supplies, ammunition, medical provisions, and detailed territorial maps. Mrs. Pemberton, shaken but unharmed, described them as professional. They knew exactly what they wanted. She told anyone who'd listen. No wasted time looking around. Just took what they came for and disappeared. Sheriff Grice investigated thoroughly, finding nothing. No tracks, no witnesses, no clues. The robbers had vanished like smoke on the wind. Around this time, Miles began noticing Isabel's night terrors. He'd wake to muffled screaming from her room, but when he checked on her, she'd be sitting up wide-eyed, claiming no memory of nightmares. The children noticed too. Samuel started having bad dreams of his own, as if fear was contagious. The third incident became personal. Miles had ridden to town for supplies, leaving Isabel with the children, as had become routine. When he returned, he found her white-faced and trembling. The children clustered around her like protective bodyguards. 3 men came by. Ben reported his young face hard with anger. Said they were looking for work, but they didn't act like hired hands. Asked too many questions about Miss Kane, where she came from, how long she'd been here. What did you tell them? Nothing, Anna said proudly. We said they'd have to talk to you, and they rode toward town. But Isabel's reaction told a different story. She was terrified in a way that transcended normal caution. That evening, after the children were asleep, Miles found her by the kitchen window, staring into darkness. You want to tell me what's really happening here? He asked gently. She remained silent so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Sometimes you can't outrun the past, no matter how far you travel or how deep you bury the truth. Before he could respond, she'd retreated to her room, leaving him alone with questions that multiplied in the darkness. The pattern continued through the following weeks. More ranches were hit with the same surgical precision. Sheriff Grice's investigations yielded nothing, but his presence around town increased significantly. He made regular patrols, now asking pointed questions, watching people with those calculating pale eyes. Miles noticed that several families had disappeared suddenly. The Johnsons, who'd run a small farm south of town, had simply vanished one morning, leaving livestock and belongings behind. A widow named Mary Catherine, who'd taken in sewing work, had closed her shop and taken the next stage to Santa Fe without explanation. Folks are getting spooked, Mrs. Finch observed during one of her visits. Can't say I blame them. Something's not right in this territory, and it's getting worse by the day. The children felt the growing tension. They'd become more protective of each other, warier of strangers. Jake and Luke practiced constantly with slingshots, becoming surprisingly accurate. Anna helped Isabel stockpile food and medical supplies as if preparing for siege. Even little Samuel had stopped wandering far from the house. Ben finally voiced what they were all thinking. We're being watched, he announced one evening over dinner. Same riders on the ridge 3 times this week. They're not hiding anymore. Miles felt familiar responsibility settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd brought these children together, promised them safety, and now danger was circling like wolves around a campfire. That night, unable to sleep, he found Isabel on the front porch. She sat motionless in the darkness, holding something that caught moonlight, a small object she quickly hid when he approached. Couldn't sleep either, he said softly. She startled, then relaxed slightly. Sometimes quiet gets too loud. He sat beside her close enough to offer comfort without crowding. They'd developed this careful dance over the months, acknowledging growing attraction, while respecting boundaries built from grief and fear. You're thinking about leaving, he said. It wasn't a question. Every day, she admitted. It would be safer for everyone if I did. Safer from what? She turned to look at him, and in the moonlight, her face held ethereal beauty, marked by infinite sadness. From the past I brought with me. From men who won't stop looking until they find what they lost. Before he could respond, she'd gone inside, leaving him alone with the desert and growing certainty that their fragile peace was about to shatter completely. The next morning dawned cold and clear frost, glittering on sparse desert grass like scattered diamonds. Miles had planned another supply run to town, but Isabel asked to accompany him the first time she'd voluntarily left the ranch since her arrival. The request surprised him, but he agreed, leaving Ben in charge with strict instructions to keep everyone close to the house. The ride to Lone Creek was tense. Isabel kept checking behind them, scanning the horizon as if expecting pursuit. Her hands, normally steady after months of ranch work, trembled as she gripped the wagon seat. Main Street bustled with its usual morning commerce. Cowboys from surrounding ranches mixed with townspeople conducting business and sharing gossip. Miles tied up outside Hannigan's store and helped Isabel down, noting how she immediately positioned herself to watch both ends of the street. They'd barely entered the store when Isabel went rigid beside him. Miles followed her gaze to three men standing near the saloon across the street. They were strangers to him, dusty, hard-looking men with the casual menace that marked them as professional trouble. But clearly they weren't strangers to Isabel. "We need to leave," she whispered, panic tightening her voice. "Now before they see me." "What's wrong?" Miles asked, but she was already backing toward the door, face pale as desert bones. "Please," she begged, "we have to go." But it was too late. One of the men, tall and lean with silver hair and a carefully trimmed beard, had turned their direction. His eyes, pale as winter ice, locked onto Isabel's face. A smile spread across his features, cold and predatory as a snake's grin. "Well, well," he called out, his cultured voice carrying clearly across the dusty street. "Look what the desert wind blew in. Hello, Isabel. Or are you using some other name these days?" The man's companions turned to look. One was massive, built like a bull with scarred knuckles and dead eyes. The other was younger, nervous with the fidgety manner of someone who relied on speed and cruelty to survive. All three wore their guns like natural extensions of their bodies. "Hulon." Isabel breathed the name, escaping like a prayer or curse. Cole Maddox stepped into the street boots, raising small dust clouds. "Been looking for you for a very long time, darling. You left so sudden, like didn't even say goodbye." Miles felt his Colt's familiar weight, but 3 against 1 were poor odds, especially in a crowded street with innocent people nearby. "Friend of yours?" he asked quietly. "The opposite," Isabel said, her voice barely audible. They retreated into the store, using the crowd as cover, while Isabel whispered fragments of truth that chilled Miles's blood. Cole Maddox and his associates, Preacher Slater, the hulking one who'd earned his nickname by torturing victims with biblical verses, and Dog-Ear Luke, whose left ear had been mostly shot off in a gunfight, weren't just outlaws. They were killers and slavers men who dealt in human misery as casually as others traded cattle. And they'd been hunting Isabel Kane for over a year. "My real name is Isabel Reyes," she whispered as they huddled behind a display of farming tools. "I was married to a man named Carlos. We had a small farm in Colorado Territory, nothing much, but it was ours." Her voice caught hands clenching into fists. Maddox and his men came through claiming they were buying supplies, but they were scouting, looking for opportunities. They took Carlos first, said they needed him to guide them to silver claims in the mountains. It was a lie. The story emerged in agonizing fragments. Maddox's gang didn't just rob and kill, they trafficked in human beings, selling women and children to the highest bidder. Isabel had been kept for months, moved from place to place, a commodity to be used and sold. "I escaped during a river crossing," she said, her voice hollow with memory. "Current was strong, rope broke. They thought I'd drowned, but I made it to shore downstream. Been running ever since." Until now, Miles said. Until now, she agreed. I thought maybe I could have a normal life again. Stupid of me. Through the store window, they watched Maddox and his men talking to Sheriff Grice. The conversation appeared casual friendly, but Miles noticed how the lawman's posture changed, became deferential. Whatever was being discussed, Grice was taking orders, not giving them. Jesus, Miles breathed. The sheriff's working with them. It explained everything, the professional robberies, the missing families, the atmosphere of fear settling over the territory. Grice wasn't investigating crimes. He was facilitating them using his badge as cover for a network that fed on the isolated and vulnerable. But then Isabel grabbed his arm, her grip painful in its intensity. Miles, there's something else. Something I haven't told you. What? She was staring at the fourth man. Now visible with Grice and Maddox's crew, someone Miles recognized with a shock that hit him like cold water. Tom Brewster stood with them nodding as Maddox spoke, his familiar face animated with discussion. Tom Brewster, who'd warned Miles about rustlers. Tom Brewster, who knew every ranch in the territory, every family, every weakness. He's been reporting to them. Isabel whispered, her voice breaking. Tom's been their scout all along, identifying targets, learning routines. That's how they know so much about everyone. The betrayal cut deeper than the physical danger. Tom had sat at Miles's table, shared coffee with Isabel, played with the children. He'd seemed like salvation when he'd helped organize the neighbors, but he'd actually been marking them for destruction. We have to get back, Miles said. Warn the children. It's too late, Isabel said, pointing toward the street. Tom Brewster was already mounting his horse, riding hard toward the Harper Ranch. He had a significant head start, and he knew shortcuts through the desert that would get him there first. As they climbed into their wagon, Miles saw the trap's full scope. The children were alone, trusting, expecting Tom Brewster as a friendly neighbor. By the time Miles and Isabel arrived, Maddox's gang would already be in position. The race back to the ranch became a nightmare of dust and desperation, knowing they were already too late to prevent whatever was coming, but unable to stop trying anyway. Sheriff Ethan Grice arrived at the Harper Ranch like a vulture in a pressed uniform, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun as he projected an air of casual authority. Miles watched him approach from the kitchen window, his hand instinctively moving to his gun. "Children, go to your rooms," he said quietly. "Stay there until I tell you otherwise." Ben started to protest at 14. He considered himself man enough to face whatever was coming. But the steel in Miles's voice silenced him. The children filed out, though Miles knew they'd be listening at doors and windows. Smart children learned early that adult conversations often determine their fate. Isabel had hidden in the root cellar, a refuge they'd prepared during sleepless nights of planning. The cellar was more than food storage. Miles's father had built it as a storm shelter, with thick timber walls and a defensible entrance. It wouldn't hold forever, but it might buy precious time. Grice dismounted slowly, pale eyes, cataloging every detail of the property. He was tall, well-groomed for a frontier lawman with the careful appearance of someone who valued control above all else. "Morning, Harper," he called out with false friendliness. "Mind if I come up? Got some official business to discuss." Miles stepped onto the porch, keeping his hands visible but ready. "Sheriff, what brings you out here? I've been hearing interesting reports about your household situation," Grice said, climbing the front steps without invitation. "Concerned citizens expressing worry about the irregularities in your living arrangements." "Not sure what you mean by that." Grice's smile was thin as a blade's edge. 6 orphaned children in the care of a man with no legal authority to keep them. A mysterious woman of questionable background living under the same roof. Some folks think it's time for proper authorities to step in. The threat was clear, wrapped in official language. Miles felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. These children are fine where they are. Are they, though? Grice stepped closer, hand resting casually on his gun. Word is, you've been struggling to provide for them. Poor food, inadequate clothing, no proper schooling. Maybe it's time these children were placed with families who can actually care for them. Over my dead body. That can be arranged. Grice replied, dropping all pretense. See, I've got reports of criminal activity on this property, harboring fugitives specifically. Woman named Isabel Reyes, wanted for questioning in connection with several deaths in Colorado territory. Miles's blood turned to ice water. They'd fabricated charges, created legal justification for whatever they planned. I don't know anyone by that name. Of course you don't. But funny thing about paperwork, it tells its own story. And this story says you're harboring a dangerous criminal around innocent children. Public safety demands immediate action. Through the window, Miles caught movement. Ben was positioning himself where he could see the front yard, probably with one of the hunting rifles. The boy had good instincts, but Miles prayed he'd have sense enough to stay hidden. Before the confrontation could escalate further, Mrs. Finch's voice cut through the tension like a church bell. Morning, Sheriff Miles. She approached from her property carrying a covered basket and wearing her usual stern expression. Brought some fresh bread for the children. The interruption caught Grice off guard. He'd prepared for confrontation, not neighborly visits. His hand moved away from his weapon as Mrs. Finch climbed the porch steps. Mrs. Finch, he said with forced politeness, wasn't expecting to see you here. I'll bet you weren't, she replied dryly, her sharp eyes taking in the tableau. Miles, where are those children I baked enough to feed half the territory? Miles realized Mrs. Finch knew exactly what was happening. Her timing was too perfect, her presence too convenient. She was creating witnesses, making it harder for Grice to act with impunity. Sheriff was just leaving, Miles said carefully. Was I? Grice's eyes narrowed dangerously. I don't think our business is finished. Oh, but it is, Mrs. Finch said with surprising firmness. Because I can see Tom Brewster riding up with some of the other neighbors. Word travels fast in small communities, especially when the sheriff makes house calls. Miles looked past Grice and saw she was right. Several riders approached, led by Tom Brewster. But now Miles knew the truth about Tom, and the approaching group looked less like rescue and more like the closing of a trap. Grice's jaw tightened as he calculated odds and appearances. Too many witnesses for whatever he'd originally planned, but Miles suspected this was just the opening move in a larger game. This isn't over, Harper, the sheriff said, mounting his horse. I'll be back with proper documentation, and next time I won't come alone. He rode off, but not before exchanging meaningful glances with Tom Brewster. Miles watched the silent communication pass between them and felt his stomach knot with dread. Thank you, he said to Mrs. Finch as the other neighbors arrived. Don't thank me yet, she replied grimly. We've bought ourselves breathing room, nothing more. That man's not going to give up, and when he comes back it won't be with legal papers. Tom Brewster and the others dismounted their faces, showing concern that Miles now knew was completely false. They'd come to assess the situation, gather intelligence, prepare for whatever Maddox had planned. Everything all right here, Miles? Tom asked with perfectly feigned worry. Saw the sheriff riding out looking upset. Just some questions about the children. Miles replied carefully, studying Tom's familiar face and seeing a stranger. Nothing we can't handle. But as the false neighbors prepared to leave, Miles caught Tom watching the house with calculating eyes, noting defensive positions, counting windows, assessing approaches. The man who'd shared his table was cataloging weaknesses, preparing intelligence reports for killers. That evening, after everyone had gone, Miles found Isabel in the root cellar, surrounded by the children. She'd been telling them stories to keep them calm, but her face was pale with strain. How much time do we have? She asked. Not much. Maybe until full dark, maybe less. The children looked between them, sensing adult fear that no amount of stories could dispel. Samuel had crawled into Anna's lap, sucking his thumb. The twins sat pressed together, their usual mischief replaced by wide-eyed worry. Even Ben, trying so hard to be grown up, looked young and frightened. "Are the bad men really coming?" Marcy asked, clutching her corn-husk doll. Miles knelt beside her, choosing words carefully. "Some dangerous people might try to hurt us, but we're going to be ready, like the soldiers in your stories," Jake asked. "The ones who protected the fort, just like that." Isabel said, her voice steadier than Miles expected. "And you know what made those soldiers brave? They took care of each other. No matter what happened, they never left anyone behind." The rest of the day passed in grim preparation. They moved supplies deeper into the cellar: water, food, medical provisions, ammunition. Miles cleaned and loaded every weapon on the property, including an old shotgun that had belonged to his father. The children helped where they could. Understanding their lives depended on being ready. As sunset painted the desert in shades of blood and gold, Miles positioned himself at the front window while Isabel watched the back. The children were in the cellar with strict orders to stay hidden regardless of what they heard above. "They'll come after full dark," Isabel said, checking her rifle for the 10th time. "Maddox likes to make an entrance, likes his victims to see death approaching." "How many?" "At least 8. Maybe more if they've recruited locals." Her voice caught slightly. "Miles, there's something else you need to know before this starts." "What?" She stared out at the darkening landscape, tears gathering in her eyes. "Carlos, my husband, he didn't die in the mountains like I told you. Maddox brought him back to the farm, made me watch while they—" She couldn't finish. Miles felt his heart clench. No wonder she'd been so damaged, so afraid. She'd survived not just captivity, but the worst kind of psychological torture. "I keep thinking about that night," she continued. "About what I could have done differently. If I'd fought harder, been smarter." "You survived," Miles said firmly. "That took more courage than fighting. But Carlos didn't. And now I've brought the same danger to you and the children." Before Miles could respond, sound drifted across the desert, distant thunder of multiple horses moving fast, no longer bothering with stealth. "They're coming," Isabel whispered. Miles extinguished the lamps, plunging the house into darkness. Through the windows, he could see lights moving closer, torches carried by riders who wanted to be seen, who wanted their targets to know death was approaching. The siege was about to begin. The attack came like a desert storm unleashed. 10 riders emerged from the darkness, torches casting writhing shadows across the scrub brush. Cole Maddox led them, sitting his horse like a king, surveying conquered territory. Behind him rode Preacher Slater Dog-Ear, Luke Sheriff Grice, Tom Brewster, and 5 other men Miles didn't recognize, a collection of killers and betrayers drawn by blood money. They formed a wide circle around the house, just beyond rifle range, their torches creating a ring of fire in the night. For several minutes, they sat in ominous silence, letting fear work its poison. Then, Maddox's voice cut through the darkness, cultured and conversational. "Isabel, darling, I know you're listening. We need to have a conversation about unfinished business." Miles crouched behind an overturned table rifle, trained on the front door. Beside him, Isabel pressed against the wall, her face ghostly pale in the starlight, filtering through windows. "You've led us quite a chase," Maddox continued. "Crossed half the territory just to find you. Do you have any idea how much that's cost me?" A rifle shot cracked through the night, the bullet splintering the door frame inches from Miles's head. Dog-Ear Luke's laughter echoed across the yard. "Now that was a warning," Maddox called out. "The next ones won't be so charitable. Here's my offer: send out Isabel, and the rest of you might live to see morning. Keep hiding her, and everyone dies slowly." Miles knew it was a lie. Men like Maddox didn't leave witnesses. But some of the gang might hesitate to murder children in cold blood, and that hesitation could be their only advantage. "Counteroffer," Miles shouted back. "Ride away now, and maybe some of you see sunrise." Harsh laughter from multiple throats answered him. Then Preacher Slater's nasal voice. "The righteous shall inherit the earth, brother, but sinners get buried in it." A second shot, this one from a different angle. They were probing defenses, testing responses, looking for weaknesses. Miles realized they could maintain this pressure all night, eroding nerves and ammunition, while staying safely out of range. Then he heard its soft sounds from the kitchen. Someone was forcing entry through the back door. Miles caught Isabel's eye and pointed toward the rear of the house. She nodded and slipped away, moving with practiced silence learned during months of running. Splintering wood from the kitchen was followed by Isabel's sharp cry of alarm. 2 men had broken in. Miles could hear their boots on wooden floors, their low voices as they searched. "Found something," one called out. "Fresh coffee, warm beds. They're here somewhere." Miles was trapped between threats, the gang outside and intruders inside. Scuffling sounds from the kitchen, then Isabel's voice tight with pain. "Miles, they've got me." It was bait, but Miles had no choice. He couldn't abandon her. He crept through the darkened house, using furniture for cover, rifle ready. In the kitchen, 2 men held Isabel between them. One was young, nervous, probably new to the gang. The other was older, scarred with the dead eyes of a career killer. Both had guns drawn. "Drop the rifle, friend," the scarred man said calmly. "Unless you want to redecorate the walls with her brains." Miles lowered his weapon, mind racing for options. "You've got what you came for. Let her go." "Oh, we're just getting started. The boss wants a proper reunion talk about old times." A child's scream pierced the night, high, terrified, unmistakably Ben's voice. Miles felt his heart stop. The children were supposed to be safe in the cellar. "Sounds like my boys found your little hidey hole." The scarred man grinned. "Kids are so trusting. All it takes is a friendly voice to get them to open up." But Miles knew that scream. It wasn't fear, it was rage. Ben wasn't being captured. He was fighting back. The realization gave Miles the split-second advantage he needed. He lunged forward, abandoning his rifle for surprise. The young gunman fired wild bullet creasing Miles's shoulder. Pain exploded down his arm, but adrenaline kept him moving. Isabel broke free, grabbing a cast-iron skillet from the stove. She brought it down on the young gunman's head with a sound like thunder. He dropped like a stone. Miles and the scarred man crashed to the floor, fighting for control of the killer's weapon. The older man was strong, experienced, but Miles had desperation fueling him. The gun went off between them, muzzle flash, lighting the kitchen like lightning. The scarred man went limp. Miles rolled away gasping and saw spreading darkness beneath the killer's body. The bullet had found its mark, though Miles couldn't remember pulling the trigger. "The children," Isabel said urgently. "We have to get to them." They ran through the house, no longer caring about stealth. The front door hung open, and torchlight flickered in the yard. Some of the gang had entered, searching room by room. The root cellar's entrance was hidden behind a false wall in the pantry. Miles yanked it aside, revealing stairs descending into darkness. At the bottom, adult voices mixed with children's cries. "Come on up, little ones," someone was saying with false gentleness. "Uncle Cole wants to meet you properly." Miles descended like an avenging angel, Isabel close behind. The cellar was larger than it appeared from above, with timber supports and stone walls that had weathered decades of desert storms. In the center, Cole Maddox stood surrounded by his remaining men, 6 children huddled at his feet. Ben had a cut above his left eye and rope burns on his wrists, but his face blazed with defiant fury. The twins clung to each other, tears streaming silently. Anna held Samuel protectively, while little Marcy stared up at Maddox, with eyes that held no fear, only pure hatred. "Ah, there you are." Maddox said pleasantly, beginning to think you'd abandoned these precious little ones. The gang leader was younger than Miles had expected, maybe 40, with silver hair and intelligent eyes. Handsome in a cold, aristocratic way, dressed like a gentleman rather than an outlaw. But madness lurked behind his cultured smile. "Let them go," Miles said, rifle aimed at Maddox's chest. "Your quarrel is with us." "Oh, but it's not that simple," Maddox replied, pulling Ben closer. The boy struggled, but Maddox held him effortlessly. "I've invested considerable time and resources tracking down my property. I expect adequate return on that investment." "I'm not your property," Isabel said, stepping into the light. "I never was. Legally speaking, that's debatable. But we're not here for legal discussions." Maddox drew his pistol, pressing it to Ben's temple. The boy's eyes went wide with terror, but he didn't cry out. "Here's how this works," Maddox continued conversationally. "You'll put down your weapons and surrender. In exchange, I'll make the children's deaths quick and painless. Refuse, and I'll take my time with each one." Miles felt the world narrow to crystalline clarity. These men had already decided to kill everyone. The only question was how much suffering they'd inflict first. The time for negotiation had ended. But then Tom Brewster stepped forward from the shadows, and Miles saw something unexpected in his neighbor's familiar face. Not the cold calculation he'd expected, but genuine anguish. "Cole, you said the children wouldn't be harmed," Tom said, his voice breaking. "You promised they'd be safe if I helped you." Maddox laughed coldly. "Did I? How naive. Children are witnesses, Tom. Witnesses have unfortunate habits of talking." The betrayal within betrayal hit Tom Brewster like a physical blow. He'd sold out his neighbors, believing he could somehow limit the damage, only to discover he'd facilitated wholesale slaughter. "I won't let you hurt them," Tom said, his hand moving toward his gun. "You'll do exactly what you're told," Preacher Slater snarled, turning his weapon on Tom. "Or join them in hell." But Tom's moment of conscience created the distraction Miles needed. Isabel the lamp. She understood immediately. Her rifle spoke, shattering the oil lamp hanging from the ceiling beam. Burning fuel rained down on two gang members, their screams filling the cellar as flames engulfed them. In the chaos, Ben drove his elbow back into Maddox's ribs with all his strength. The gang leader cursed and staggered, his shot going wild. Ben broke free, diving toward his siblings. "Now," Miles shouted. The cellar erupted in gunfire. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like deadly fireworks. Miles pushed the children behind supply crates, shielding them with his body as bullets whined overhead. Tom Brewster, trying to redeem himself, grappled with Preacher Slater. Both men went down, wrestling for control of Slater's gun. The weapon discharged, and Tom Brewster's betrayal ended in blood and desperate redemption. "On the stairs," Isabel shouted. "We have to reach the stairs." But their escape route was blocked by burning men and flying lead. They were trapped in the cellar with diminishing options and murderous enemies who had nothing left to lose. Then salvation arrived in the form of voices from above, real neighbors, this time shouting orders, boots thundering on wooden floors. Mrs. Finch had rallied the community, brought help when it was most desperately needed. "Oh, Harper, you down there?" John Lowry's voice echoed down the stairwell. "Oh, we're here," Miles shouted back. "Hostiles in the cellar." What followed was nightmare chaos of smoke, fire, and gunshots. Gang members caught between defenders below and rescuers above fought with cornered desperation. But their numbers were dwindling, their leader wounded. Cole Maddox, his fine clothes torn and bloody, made one final desperate play. He lunged for little Marcy, grabbing her around the waist and pressing his gun to her head. "Everyone stop," he screamed, his cultured voice cracking with strain. "Stop, or the girl dies." The shooting ceased. In sudden silence, Marcy's quiet sobs seemed thunderously loud. I'm walking out of here, Maddox declared, backing toward the stairs with Marcy as human shield. Anyone tries to stop me, and I paint these walls with her innocent blood. He began his retreat, dragging the terrified child. Marcy looked back at Miles with eyes full of trust, believing with childlike faith that he would save her somehow. Miles couldn't get a clear shot. Maddox kept Marcy between himself and any weapon. One miscalculation, and the child would die. Then Isabel stepped forward, hands raised, rifle on the ground. "Take me instead," she said. "I'm what you really want." Maddox paused, considering. Tempting offer. But I think I'll keep the girl as insurance. You can come along too if you're eager to renew our acquaintance. He continued, backing toward the stairs, grip tightening on Marcy's throat. The little girl was turning blue, struggling to breathe in his strangling hold. That's when Ben acted with the selfless courage of someone far older than his 14 years. The boy had worked his way around the cellar wall, moving like a ghost through shadows and smoke. His hands were free now, and he'd found a broken piece of timber, a sharp splinter as long as a knife blade. With a cry of pure rage, Ben drove the makeshift weapon deep into Maddox's thigh. The gang leader screamed and stumbled, his grip on Marcy, loosening for one crucial instant. It was enough. Miles's rifle spoke once, the sound deafening in the confined space. Cole Maddox spun around, clutching his chest, eyes wide with genuine surprise. He looked down at the spreading red stain, then up at Miles. "Well played," he said, and collapsed. The remaining gang members threw down their weapons immediately. Without their leader, they were just frightened men facing overwhelming odds. John Lowry and the other neighbors secured them quickly, binding hands and legs with practiced efficiency. Miles gathered his children around him, checking each one for injuries. They were frightened, traumatized, but alive. Ben's cut would need stitches. The twins were shaking with shock, but they would recover with time and love. "Is it over?" Anna asked, her voice small and scared. "It's over," Miles promised, pulling her close. "The bad men can't hurt us anymore." Isabel knelt beside Cole Maddox's body, her face unreadable. The man who destroyed her life, murdered her husband, stolen her freedom, was finally dead. But there was no triumph in her expression, only deep, weary sadness. "It doesn't bring them back," she said quietly. "Carlos, all the others. None of it brings them back." Miles placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "No. But it stops him from hurting anyone else." Sheriff Grice was found dead in the yard, apparently killed when the neighbors arrived. His body yielded a saddlebag full of money and documents, evidence of the trafficking network that had spread like cancer across 3 territories. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and hope, Miles Harper stood on his front porch and surveyed the aftermath. The house was scarred, but standing. His family was traumatized, but intact. And for the first time in months, the horizon held no threats. The healing could finally begin. The weeks following the siege passed in a blur of officials' investigations and slowly returning normalcy. Territorial marshals arrived to unravel the trafficking network, conducting interviews that revealed the operation's staggering scope. At least 60 people had disappeared over 2 years, with survivors found in remote locations across 3 territories. Isabel's testimony proved crucial, her detailed knowledge helping authorities dismantle remaining cells and rescue victims. Each session was painful, dredging up memories she tried to bury, but she persevered, knowing her words might prevent others from suffering similar fates. The children recovered at different rates. Ben's wound healed cleanly, leaving only a thin scar above his eyebrow, but he carried himself differently now, with quiet confidence earned through testing. He'd crossed the line from boy to young man in that desperate moment when he'd chosen to save Marcy at the cost of his own safety. The twins struggled more with nightmares and sudden fears. Jake would wake screaming while Luke became clingy and afraid to leave the house. Miles spent many nights reading to them by lamplight, providing comfort and reassurance that took time to truly sink in. Anna threw herself into household tasks with renewed determination, finding healing in routine and purpose. She organized the pantry, mended clothes, and appointed herself keeper of Samuel's bedtime stories. Her practical nature demanded concrete ways to help the family function. Little Samuel, at 4, bounced back with the resilience of very young children. Within days, he was playing again, chattering happily about everyday things. But he stayed closer to the adults now, as if some deep part of him remembered danger and refused to let protectors stray too far. Marcy presented the greatest challenge. The girl who'd once been full of fire and defiance became quiet and withdrawn. She stopped talking for nearly a week, communicating only through nods and headshakes. When speech finally returned, her first words were, "Is the bad man really dead?" "Yes, sweetheart," Miles assured her. "He's gone forever." "Good," she said with fierce satisfaction. "I didn't like him at all." Isabel wrestled with her own demons. The confrontation with Maddox had brought buried memories surging back, and she often sat on the porch staring into desert distances, wrestling with ghosts that wouldn't rest quietly. She jumped at shadows, initially reaching for weapons that weren't there, expecting threats that never materialized. Mrs. Finch proved unexpectedly supportive, arriving each morning with food, practical help, and no-nonsense attitude that cut through trauma's fog. She organized neighborhood women into a support network, ensuring the Harper household had everything needed for healing. "Grief's like setting a broken bone," she told Miles one morning as they watched children play in the yard. "Hurts like hell initially, but set it right and give it time, it heals stronger than before." Tom Brewster's redemption had cost him his life, but it had also provided crucial intelligence that helped authorities track down trafficking network remnants. His widow Mary visited once to apologize and explain. Tom had accumulated gambling debts, and Maddox had used that leverage to force cooperation. He genuinely believed he could limit damage, protect innocent people, while serving his blackmailers. "He died trying to save your children," Mary said through tears. "I hope that counts for something." "It counts for everything," Miles replied. In the end, he chose to do right. 3 weeks after the siege, an unexpected visitor arrived. Jonathan Whitmore was a well-dressed man in his 50s, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to responsibility. He introduced himself as a lawyer from Denver. "I've been searching for a young lady named Marcy Taylor," he said, producing a small silver locket from his vest pocket. "I believe she may be in your care." The locket was engraved with an ornate T and contained a miniature portrait of a woman with Marcy's distinctive dark eyes. Miles had seen the child playing with an identical piece, one of the few possessions she'd carried when found wandering in the desert. "Marcy's family?" Miles asked. "Her grandparents. They've been searching since the Apache raid took her parents' wagon train. They'd nearly given up hope when word reached them about recent events here." Marcy was called from the yard, still clutching her corn-husk doll. When she saw the locket, her face lit with pure joy. "Grandmama's picture," she exclaimed, taking it with careful hands. "She gave it to Mama before we left for California." Whitmore smiled gently. "Your grandparents sent me to find you, little one. They want you to come home to Denver." The news created bittersweet emotions throughout the household. Everyone was happy Marcy had living family who wanted her, but losing her felt like another small death. She'd become so integral to their makeshift family that imagining life without her seemed nearly impossible. But Whitmore brought more than reunion plans. Marcy's grandfather was a successful merchant who'd built considerable fortune in mining and transportation. He'd established a trust fund for his granddaughter, not vast wealth, but enough to ensure her future and provide quality education. "There's something else," Whitmore continued. "Mr. Taylor is well aware of what you've done for his granddaughter. He's instructed me to offer compensation for her care and help with expenses related to the other children." Miles started to refuse. He hadn't taken in children for money, But Whitmore raised a restraining hand. "Consider it investment in family," the lawyer said. Mr. Taylor believes strongly in keeping children together when possible. He's also aware you've suffered losses providing this care. Let him help Mr. Harper. It's the least he can do. The offer was generous enough to secure the ranch's future pay, outstanding debts, and ensure remaining children would have everything they needed. More importantly, it came without strings that the Taylors simply wanted to help the man who'd saved their granddaughter's life. As legal matters were settled, Miles faced a question he'd been avoiding: what happened next, and the immediate crisis had passed. Children were safe, and the future looked more secure than it had in months. But what kind of future would it be? The answer came from Ben, now 15, and looking older than his years. He approached Miles one evening as he sat on the porch contemplating tomorrow. "I've been thinking about families," the boy said, settling beside him. "About what makes people belong to each other. Oh, we're not related by blood, any of us. But we're family just the same, aren't we?" Miles nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "Then maybe it's time we made it official. Legal adoption, I mean. Make it so nobody can ever split us up again." The suggestion was both simple and profound. Legal adoption would give Miles formal custody, but more importantly, it would give the children security of knowing they belonged somewhere permanently. "What do the others think?" "We talked about it. All of us want to stay together. Anna says she never wants to live anywhere else. The twins say you're the only father they remember. And Samuel drew you a picture of our family stick figures holding hands in front of a house. That's how he sees us." That night, Miles discussed the idea with Isabel as they shared coffee and comfortable silence in the kitchen. Their relationship had deepened during the crisis, built on shared danger and mutual trust, but neither had spoken about what that might mean for their future. "They want to make it permanent," he explained Ben's proposal. "Legal adoption for all of them." "That's wonderful," Isabel said, her face lighting up. "They need that security." "What about you?" Miles asked quietly. "Where do you fit in all this?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee. "I don't know. I've been running so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay in one place." "You could learn," Miles said. "We could learn together." She looked up, then hope warring with fear in her dark eyes. "It's not that simple. I'm damaged, Miles. What happened with Maddox, with Carlos? It changed me. I don't know if I can be what you need, what the children need." "You already are," he said simply. "You saved us all, Isabel. Not just from Maddox, but from despair. You brought life back to this house. And you brought me back from the dead." She replied softly. "When I was sitting in that dusty street begging for scraps, I thought my story was over. You gave me purpose again." The conversation continued late into the night, two damaged souls finding their way toward healing and hope. By morning, they had reached their decision. 6 months later, the Harper Ranch bustled with celebration as the entire community prepared for dual ceremonies. The adoption papers had been finalized, making Ben, Jake, Luke, Anna, and Samuel officially part of the Harper family. Marcy had gone to live with her grandparents in Denver, but she'd already sent 4 letters describing her new life and promising visits. The territorial governor had attended the adoption ceremony, praising Miles for his community service and role in breaking the trafficking network. A medal was presented, though Miles felt uncomfortable with such recognition. He'd simply done what any decent person would do, protected his family. But today's celebration was different. Today, Miles Harper was getting married. The ceremony was held in the ranch's front yard with Preacher Abner officiating, and the entire community in attendance. Mrs. Finch had insisted on making the cake a 3-layer masterpiece that dominated the refreshment table. John Lowry and other neighbors had built an arch of desert flowers for the couple to stand beneath. Isabel wore a simple dress of blue cotton, her dark hair arranged with wildflowers the children had gathered that morning. She'd gained weight since those dark days after the siege, her face losing the hollow, haunted look that had marked her arrival. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was at peace. She was at. Miles wore his best suit, the same one he'd married Sarah in 15 years earlier. The memory might have troubled him once, but now it seemed appropriate. The past was part of who he was, but it didn't define his future. The children stood with them, Ben as best man, Anna as maid of honor, with the younger ones serving as ring bearers and flower girls. They'd been part of the proposal part of the planning part of every decision. This wasn't just marriage between two people. It was formal creation of a family that already existed in every way that mattered. Do you, Miles Harper, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer and poorer, for better and worse? Till death do you part. I do, Miles said, his voice strong and sure. And do you, Isabel Reyes, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer and poorer, for better and worse? Till death do you part. I do, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Miles, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was gentle, tender, witnessed by 6 children, who cheered and applauded as if they'd orchestrated everything themselves. In many ways, they had their acceptance of Isabel. Their insistence on staying together as family had made this moment possible. The celebration continued into evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed half the territory. Stories were told, toasts were made, and for the first time in years, the Harper Ranch echoed with pure, uncomplicated joy. As sunset painted the desert in familiar shades of gold and promise, Jonathan Whitmore approached Miles with a small package. Wedding gift from the Taylor family in Denver, the lawyer said with a smile. Inside was a photographed formal portrait of a well-dressed family standing before an elegant house. At the center stood Marcy, barely recognizable in her fine dress and carefully arranged hair, but still clutching a familiar corn husk doll. Her grandparents flanked her faces, beaming with pride and love. On the back, in a child's careful handwriting, "My new family and my old family. I love you all. Marcy Taylor Harper." Miles felt his throat tighten with emotion. The little girl had found her place in the world, surrounded by people who cherished her. It was everything he could have hoped for. "There's something else," Whitmore said, producing an official document. "Mr. Taylor has established an educational fund for all the Harper children. Full scholarships to any school they choose when they're old enough. He believes strongly in education's power to change lives." The generosity was overwhelming, but Miles understood the motivation. Marcy's grandfather was paying forward kindness shown to his granddaughter, ensuring other children would have similar opportunities. As evening deepened and guests began departing, the Harper family gathered on the front porch. Miles and Isabel sat side by side, her head resting on his shoulder, while children sprawled around them in comfortable contentment. "Tell us a story, Pa," Samuel requested, using the name he'd adopted after the legal proceedings. "What kind of story?" Miles asked. "A happy one," Anna said firmly, "with a good ending." Miles thought for a moment, then began. "Once upon a time, there was a man who thought his story was over. He'd lost everything that mattered, and he didn't see any reason to keep going. But then he discovered something important. Sometimes, when your story ends, it's really just the beginning of a new chapter." "Well, what happened next?" Jake asked, though he'd heard variations of this tale many times. He met some other people whose stories had ended too. Children who'd lost their families, a woman who'd lost her home. Together, they discovered that broken people can help heal each other. They became a family, not because they were related, but because they chose to be. "And did they live happily ever after?" Luke wanted to know. Miles looked around at faces surrounding him, his wife, his children, his family. They'd all been broken in different ways, all carried scars that would never fully heal. But they'd found something precious in shared brokenness knowledge that love could triumph over loss, that hope could survive despair, that families could be built on more than blood. They lived, he said simply, and that was enough. The desert wind picked up, carrying scents of sage and possibility. In the distance, coyotes began their nightly song, but the sound no longer seemed lonely or threatening. It was simply part of the vast, beautiful wilderness surrounding their small island of light and warmth. As the family gradually moved inside for the night, Miles lingered on the porch with Isabel. The desert stretched endlessly before them, full of hidden dangers and unexpected beauty. It had tested them, broken them, and ultimately made them stronger. "Are you happy?" He asked the question, carrying weight of everything they'd endured together. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "For the first time in years, I'm truly happy. We all are." She was right. Despite everything they'd suffered, losses, trauma, nights of terror, they'd found their way to happiness. Not simple, uncomplicated joy, but something deeper and more precious, hard-won contentment of people who'd faced life's worst and refused to surrender. "I have something to tell you," Isabel said suddenly, her voice carrying notes of excitement and nervousness. Everyone turned to look at her, sensing something momentous in her tone. "I saw Doc Morrison in town today." She continued, her hand moving unconsciously to her stomach. "We're going to have a baby." The announcement hit the family like lightning. Children erupted in excited chatter, while Miles sat stunned, mind reeling with implications. A baby. New life born from ashes of so much death and destruction. It seemed impossible, miraculous, like a final gift from a universe that had tested them so harshly. When he managed to ask, "Spring," Isabel said, eyes shining with joyful tears. "The baby will come in spring." Spring. Time of renewal, new beginnings, hope triumphant over despair. Miles pulled his wife close, overwhelmed by the magnitude of blessing they'd been given. Children had already begun making plans. Anna announced she would teach the baby to read. The twins promised to show him or her how to catch fish and climb trees. Samuel declared he would share his toys, though he might keep the best ones. Ben, maintaining dignity as eldest, simply smiled and said he looked forward to being a big brother. As the family finally went inside, Miles and Isabel remained on the porch a few moments longer. The desert night settled around them, peaceful and protective, while inside the house, 7 people prepared for sleep under one roof, dreaming of tomorrow and all the tomorrows stretching ahead like endless horizons of possibility. Their story had ended in darkness of grief and despair. But like desert dawn painting each new day in shades of gold and promise, it had begun again in light of love and hope. And this time, it was a story with no ending, only new chapters written day by day, choice by choice, in the beautiful, difficult, infinitely rewarding work of being a family. The wind carried sounds of settling livestock, children getting ready for bed, a household preparing for another night of peaceful sleep. Normal sounds, everyday sounds, but precious beyond measure to people who'd learned how quickly normalcy could shatter. Miles looked up at stars emerging in the darkening sky, thinking about graves on the hill where his first family rested. The pain would never fully disappear, but it had transformed into something else. Reminder of how precious life was, how important it was to cherish every moment with people you loved. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The baby would mean sleepless nights and fresh worries. Older children would grow up and make their own choices. The desert would test them with drought and storm and all the uncertainties of frontier life. But they would face those challenges together as a family united by something stronger than blood or law. They had been broken and made whole, scattered, and brought together, lost and found. In the end, that was the only story that mattered, not the tale of what they'd lost, but the story of what they'd found in each other. A family built on love, forged in fire, and strong enough to withstand whatever the future might bring. The desert night settled over the Harper Ranch, peaceful and protective. While inside the house, 8 people slept safely under one roof, soon to be 9. They dreamed of tomorrow and all the possibilities it held of children growing up strong and loved of new life, taking its first breath in a world made safer by their courage. Miles took Isabel's hand as they finally went inside, closing the door on another day in their new life. In the months and years to come, there would be joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge, all the ordinary miracles that make up a life lived fully. But tonight, under the vast desert sky, dotted with eternal stars, they had everything they needed, each other hope for tomorrow. And the unshakable knowledge that love was stronger than loss, that families could be built from the most unlikely materials, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories began with the words, "I thought it was over." Their tale had no ending, the only continuation written in the laughter of children, the whispered promises of lovers, the daily choices that transformed strangers into family, and houses into homes. And in the distance, carried on the desert wind, came the sound that had once seemed so lonely, but now felt like benediction, coyotes singing to the moon. And their voices joined in ancient harmony, welcoming another day of survival, another chapter in the endless story of those who choose love over fear, hope over despair, and life over death.